What starts as a desperate bid at a maritime salvage auction to save his failing apple orchard leads one farmer into a web of Cold War espionage, revealing that a mysterious shipping container holds not just forgotten spy equipment, but evidence that could rewrite history and connect him to a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of both American and Russian intelligence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Whitfield had never imagined himself standing in the rain-soaked auction yard of Portland's waterfront, surrounded by shipping containers that towered like metal mountains against the gray Oregon sky. The desperation that had driven him here felt as heavy as the storm clouds overhead, pressing down on his shoulders with the weight of 3 generations of agricultural legacy about to slip through his calloused fingers. At 47, he represented the latest chapter in a family story that had begun when his great-grandfather planted the first apple trees in Cedar Valley, transforming rocky soil into productive orchards through sheer determination and an immigrant's dream of American prosperity. The morning had started like so many others that season, with Marcus checking weather forecasts that seemed determined to conspire against him. Climate change had turned Oregon's once predictable growing seasons into a meteorological casino where the house always won. The previous year's unprecedented heat dome had scorched nearly half his Honeycrisp crop, while this year's late frost had devastated the pink lady varieties that commanded premium prices at farmers' markets. His accountant's warning from last week still echoed in his mind. Without a significant influx of capital, Whitfield Orchards would face foreclosure by winter's end. The auction had been Sarah Chen's idea. As the county agricultural extension agent and one of the few people who still believed in traditional farming methods, she had mentioned it during one of their regular coffee meetings at the Cascade Diner. Maritime salvage auctions sometimes have equipment that could be repurposed for agricultural use, she had suggested, sliding a flyer across the worn Formica table. I know it's unconventional, but desperate times call for creative solutions. The logic had seemed sound enough. Industrial pumps, generators, even storage units could potentially be acquired for pennies on the dollar compared to new agricultural equipment. Standing now among professional salvagers and maritime enthusiasts, Marcus felt distinctly out of place in his faded work jacket and mud-caked boots. The auctioneer, Jack Henderson, commanded the crowd's attention with practiced efficiency, his voice carrying over the drumming rain as he described each lot with the enthusiasm of a carnival barker. Most items drew spirited bidding from the regulars: diesel engines, navigation equipment, containers filled with unclaimed cargo that might contain anything from electronics to textiles. Bailey, Marcus's German shepherd, had insisted on accompanying him despite the weather. The dog sat alertly at his feet, seemingly unbothered by the rain that had already soaked through Marcus's jacket. At 5 years old, Bailey had been Marcus's constant companion since his divorce, a steady presence during the long days of maintaining the orchard alone. There was something almost uncanny about the dog's intelligence, the way he seemed to understand not just commands, but emotions, offering quiet comfort during the darkest moments of Marcus's struggles. The afternoon wore on with Marcus watching. Lot after lot sell for prices that, while reasonable for maritime salvage, still stretched beyond his carefully calculated budget. He had nearly decided to leave when Henderson announced lot number 47, a weathered shipping container with unusual markings, origins unknown, contents sealed since recovery from an abandoned cargo ship in international waters. The starting bid was surprisingly low, perhaps because the container showed significant exterior damage and offered no guarantee about what might be inside. Something about the container caught Marcus's attention. Unlike the standard shipping units with their corporate logos and tracking numbers, this one bore strange symbols and what appeared to be Cyrillic lettering beneath layers of rust and salt corrosion. The manifest listed it as unclaimed salvage, contents unknown, sold as is. Most serious bidders seemed uninterested in such a gamble, but Marcus found himself raising his paddle almost unconsciously when Henderson called for opening bids. The bidding remained tepid, with only 2 other participants showing mild interest. Within minutes, Marcus had secured the container for just under $2,000, a significant sum for his strained finances, but far less than he had budgeted. For agricultural equipment, as he signed the paperwork in Henderson's cramped office, the auctioneer raised an eyebrow at the farmer's purchase. "Interesting choice, Mr. Whitfield. That container's been in our yard for months. Nobody could make sense of those markings or trace its origin. Hope you find something useful inside." The logistics of transporting the container to Cedar Valley required calling in a favor from Tommy Martinez, a childhood friend who operated a heavy equipment company. "You bought what at a maritime auction?" Tommy had laughed over the phone. "Man, farming must be rougher than I thought if you're gambling on mystery boxes." Despite his teasing, Tommy agreed to transport the container to Whitfield Orchards the following day, adding it to his schedule between construction deliveries. That evening, as Marcus sat on his porch overlooking the orchards his family had tended for generations, he questioned the wisdom of his impulsive purchase. The rational part of his mind calculated the risk. $2,000 that could have gone toward loan payments or equipment repairs, spent instead on what might turn out to be a container full of worthless cargo or, worse, hazardous materials, requiring expensive disposal. Yet something about the container's mysterious nature had resonated with him, perhaps reflecting his own desperate need for an unexpected solution to seemingly insurmountable problems. Bailey settled beside him on the porch, the dog's warm presence a comfort against the cool evening air. The shepherd had been unusually attentive since returning from the auction, following Marcus more closely than usual and occasionally whining softly as if sensing his owner's anxiety about the purchase. "What do you think, boy?" Marcus asked, absently stroking the dog's damp fur. "Did we just make the dumbest decision of our lives? Or is there something to this feeling I can't shake?" The container arrived the next morning, Tommy's flatbed truck groaning under its weight as it navigated the narrow access road to the equipment shed. Marcus had cleared a space in the old barn's lower level, deciding to keep his mysterious purchase out of sight until he could properly investigate its contents. The process of unloading required Tommy's crane truck and several hours of careful maneuvering, made more challenging by intermittent rain showers that turned the ground into slippery mud. "Whatever's in there must be heavy," Tommy observed as they finally positioned the container inside the barn. "This thing weighs at least twice what an empty container should. You sure you don't want to open it while I'm here with the equipment? Might need help with whatever's inside." Marcus considered the offer, but ultimately declined, feeling an inexplicable need to explore the container's contents privately first. Something about the situation felt too personal, too potentially significant to share immediately. After Tommy departed, Marcus stood before the container with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Up close, the Cyrillic lettering was more visible, though still largely illegible beneath decades of weathering. The locking mechanism appeared unusually complex for a standard shipping container, featuring multiple points of security and what looked like tamper-evident seals that had somehow remained intact. Using a borrowed angle grinder, Marcus carefully cut through the external locks, working methodically to avoid damaging whatever might be stored inside. The moment the final lock fell away, Bailey began exhibiting strange behavior. The normally Calm dog paced anxiously around the container, whining and pawing at the ground as if detecting something beyond human perception. When Marcus finally pulled open the heavy doors, a musty scent escaped. Not the mildew or decay he had expected, but something almost antiseptic, like a laboratory that had been sealed for decades. Inside, the container revealed not random cargo, but a meticulously organized array of equipment, each piece secured in custom-fitted compartments lined with protective padding. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What struck Marcus immediately was the obvious military or intelligence nature of the contents. Communication devices with Soviet-era markings, sealed document cases bearing classification stamps, and what appeared to be surveillance equipment. Unlike anything he had seen outside of spy movies. His hands trembling slightly, Marcus reached for the nearest document case, noting the heavy security seals and warnings in both Russian and English. As he carefully broke the first seal, he had no way of knowing that this simple action would set in motion a chain of events connecting him to one of the Cold War's most closely guarded operations. The documents inside, perfectly preserved by the container's environmental controls, would soon attract the attention of intelligence agencies on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. Bailey's continued agitation finally drew Marcus's attention to a specific section of the container's interior. Following the dog's focused interest, Marcus discovered a hidden compartment concealed behind what appeared to be a false wall. Inside lay additional equipment, and most intriguingly, a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth. The journal's first page bore a name that would soon upend everything Marcus thought he knew about his family history. Henry Whitfield, his grandfather, who had supposedly lived his entire life as a simple Oregon farmer. As rain began drumming on the barn's metal roof, Marcus settled onto an overturned crate and opened the journal with trembling hands. The neat handwriting, so familiar from birthday cards and letters he had treasured since childhood, began with an entry dated October 15th, 1961. Today I was approached by men from the agency. They spoke of duty, of service beyond the orchards, of secrets that could prevent the unthinkable. How does one refuse when the alternative might be nuclear winter? The implications of what he was reading slowly dawned on Marcus. His grandfather, the man who had taught him to graft apple trees and read weather patterns, had apparently led a double life as some kind of intelligence operative. The equipment in the container wasn't random Soviet spy gear. It was connected to his own family's hidden history, a legacy of service that had remained buried for decades until this desperate purchase at a maritime auction had brought it to light. Bailey finally settled at Marcus's feet, his earlier agitation replaced by what seemed like satisfaction, as if the dog had somehow known this discovery was meant to happen. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming rhythms on the barn roof that seemed to echo the rapid beating of Marcus's heart as he turned to the next page of his grandfather's secret journal, unaware that he was about to uncover a conspiracy that would soon bring federal agents to his doorstep and reveal that the Whitfield family's role in American intelligence was far from over. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, casting long shadows across the mysterious container as Marcus continued reading his grandfather's journal. Each page revealed another layer of a life he never knew existed, transforming his understanding of the man who had taught him everything about apple cultivation while apparently harboring secrets that reached into the darkest corners of the Cold War. Sarah Chen's arrival interrupted his reading. She had promised to stop by after her morning rounds to help assess the orchard's storm damage, but her cheerful greeting died on her lips when she saw Marcus hunched over the journal, surrounded by opened equipment cases. "Marcus, what's all this?" Her eyes widened as she took in the array of Soviet-era devices, the carefully preserved documents, and the obvious military nature of the container's contents. Marcus looked up, his expression a mixture of confusion and wonder. "Remember that container I bought at the auction? Turns out it wasn't just random salvage." He gestured at the equipment surrounding them. "This belonged to my grandfather. He was involved in some kind of intelligence operation during the Cold War. I had no idea." Sarah moved closer, her agricultural expertise suddenly irrelevant in the face of this unexpected discovery. She examined one of the communication devices, noting the Cyrillic lettering and the sophisticated construction that seemed decades ahead of its time. "This is incredible. Your grandfather was Henry Whitfield, right? The man who developed those drought-resistant apple varieties back in the 60s? "Apparently that wasn't all he was developing," Marcus replied, holding up the journal. "According to this, he was recruited in 1961 to assist with something called Operation Clearwater. He was using the orchard as cover for intelligence work, meeting with Soviet contacts, transmitting coded messages. The whole time he was teaching me about grafting techniques and soil composition, he was living this double life." The weight of the revelation settled between them. Sarah, always practical, was the first to voice the obvious concern. "Marcus, if this is real, and it certainly looks authentic, you need to contact the authorities. This isn't just family history. This could be significant historical evidence, maybe even still classified material." Bailey, who had been resting quietly nearby, suddenly stood and moved toward the barn entrance, his ears perked forward in alert attention. Moments later, the sound of approaching vehicles became audible. Not the familiar rumble of farm equipment, but the purposeful approach of multiple cars moving with coordinated precision. "Were you expecting anyone?" Sarah asked, noting the dog's defensive posture. Marcus shook his head, quickly closing the journal and placing it back among the documents. Through the barn's small window, he could see 3 black SUVs pulling up to his farmhouse, their government plates visible even from a distance. Men in dark suits emerged, with the kind of purposeful movement that suggested federal authority and urgent business. "That was fast," Sarah murmured. "How could they possibly know about this already?" The question would haunt Marcus later, but in the moment, he was focused on the immediate reality of federal agents approaching his property with obvious interest in what he had discovered. As he stepped out of the barn to meet them, Bailey close at his heel, he wondered if his grandfather had experienced similar moments, ordinary life interrupted by the extraordinary demands of Secret Service. The lead agent, a tall man with prematurely gray hair, presented his credentials with practiced efficiency. "Mr. Whitfield, I'm Special Agent Robert Mitchell, FBI. We need to discuss a shipping container you purchased yesterday at the Portland Maritime Auction." The speed of their response suggested either remarkable surveillance capabilities or, more unsettling, that someone had been waiting for this container to surface. Marcus found himself wondering which scenario was more troubling as he led the agents toward the barn, where decades-old secrets waited to be fully unveiled. Inside the barn, Agent Mitchell's professional composure cracked slightly upon seeing the array of equipment. He immediately called for his team to secure the area, speaking rapidly into his radio, using codes that meant nothing to Marcus, but clearly communicated urgency to his colleagues. Within minutes, the barn had transformed from a storage space into something resembling a crime scene, though Marcus noted they treated everything with reverence rather than suspicion. "Mr. Whitfield," Mitchell said, his tone now more measured, "what you've discovered here appears to be connected to a Cold War intelligence operation that's been the subject of historical inquiry for decades. The fact that it surfaced now in this manner raises significant questions. Marcus watched as federal agents carefully photographed and catalogued each piece of equipment, each document, treating the contents of his impulse auction purchase with the kind of care usually reserved for museum artifacts. "I had no idea what was in the container when I bought it," he explained. "I was just looking for equipment to help save my orchard. Finding my grandfather's journal, learning about his involvement in whatever this was. It's all been a shock." Mitchell nodded, seeming to accept the explanation. Henry Whitfield's name appears in several declassified documents from the period, though always with significant redactions. He was what we called a civilian asset, someone who provided crucial support to intelligence operations while maintaining their normal life as cover. The agent's words painted a picture of a world Marcus had never imagined existing in Cedar Valley. His grandfather, who had been known throughout the region for developing apple varieties that could withstand Oregon's increasingly unpredictable climate, had apparently been using agricultural research as cover for intelligence work. The innovative farming techniques that had made Whitfield Orchards successful had been genuine, but they had also provided perfect justification for the unusual visitors, late-night activities, and occasional unexplained absences that, in retrospect, must have punctuated his grandfather's life. "The equipment in this container," Mitchell continued, moving toward a sophisticated radio apparatus, "represents technology that was remarkably advanced for its time. Some of these devices were thought to have been lost when a Soviet defectors ship went down in the North Pacific in 1983. The fact that they've been preserved in this condition is remarkable." Sarah, who had been observing quietly from the sidelines, stepped forward. "Agent Mitchell, what does this mean for Marcus? He bought this container legally at a public auction. Surely he's not in any trouble." Mitchell's expression softened slightly. "No, Mr. Whitfield isn't in any trouble. In fact, his discovery may help resolve several historical mysteries that have puzzled intelligence historians for years. However, we will need to secure these materials for proper analysis and documentation." The prospect of losing the tangible connection to his grandfather's secret life, just as he had discovered it, struck Marcus with unexpected force. "The journal," he said, perhaps too quickly. "My grandfather's journal. That's personal family history. Surely I can keep that." Mitchell hesitated, clearly weighing security protocols against human sentiment. "We'll need to document its contents thoroughly, but I understand its personal significance. Once we've confirmed it doesn't contain information that could compromise ongoing operations, which seems unlikely given its age, we can discuss returning it to you." As the afternoon progressed, more vehicles arrived, bringing specialists who set up sophisticated equipment throughout the barn. Marcus watched as experts in period technology carefully examined each device. Their excitement barely contained professional demeanor as they encountered equipment thought lost to history. Occasionally, someone would exclaim softly in Russian or English as they discovered something particularly significant. A linguistic expert was brought in to translate the Cyrillic markings on the container's exterior. As she worked, she explained to Marcus that the symbols indicated not just Soviet military designation, but a specific department within the KGB that had been responsible for technological espionage. "This container was meant to disappear," she said, running her fingers over the faded lettering. "The fact that it survived intact suggests someone went to great lengths to preserve it." Throughout the investigation, Bailey remained unusually attentive, positioning himself between Marcus and the strangers invading his territory. The dog's protective instincts seemed heightened, as if he sensed the significance of what was unfolding. Agent Mitchell noticed the shepherd's behavior and commented, "Remarkable animal. We've documented cases where dogs seem to detect electromagnetic signatures from certain types of equipment. It's possible he sensed something unusual about the container even before you opened it." As evening approached, a woman in civilian clothes arrived, introduced as Dr. Elena Novak, a Cold War historian consulting with the FBI on cases involving recovered intelligence materials. Unlike the agents with their clinical efficiency, she approached the discovery with barely contained enthusiasm. Mr. Whitfield, what you've uncovered here could fill crucial gaps in our understanding of civilian intelligence networks during the Cold War. Your grandfather was part of something we've only had fragments of until now. She explained that Operation Clearwater had been a joint effort between American intelligence and select Soviet defectors to prevent nuclear escalation during the most dangerous periods of the Cold War. Both sides had factions pushing for confrontation, she said, examining a coded message device. Your grandfather was part of a network that worked to provide accurate information to moderate voices on both sides, helping prevent misunderstandings that could have led to catastrophe. The revelation cast Henry Whitfield's life in an entirely new light. The man Marcus had known as a patient teacher and innovative farmer had been quietly working to prevent nuclear war, using his agricultural reputation as cover for meetings that might have altered the course of history. The apple varieties he developed hadn't just been about improving crop yields. They had provided legitimate reasons for international agricultural exchanges that served as cover for intelligence operations. As darkness fell, portable lights were brought in to continue the documentation process. Mitchell approached Marcus with a proposal. Mr. Whitfield, given the historical significance of this discovery and your family's connection to it, we'd like to offer you the opportunity to be involved in the investigation process. Your knowledge of your grandfather's public life might help us understand aspects of his covert activities. The offer surprised Marcus. He had expected to be pushed aside once the professionals arrived, his role reduced to that of accidental discoverer. Instead, they were inviting him into the process, recognizing that his understanding of Henry Whitfield the farmer might provide crucial context for understanding Henry Whitfield the intelligence asset. There's something else, Mitchell added, lowering his voice. The timing of this discovery is significant. We've been tracking increased activity among certain groups interested in Cold War intelligence materials. The fact that this container surfaced now and that you, Henry Whitfield's grandson, were the one to acquire it raises questions about whether this was truly coincidence. The implication sent a chill through Marcus. Had someone orchestrated this discovery? Was the container's appearance at the auction more than mere chance? The thought that he might have been manipulated into finding his grandfather's secret legacy added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming situation. Dr. Novak interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Mr. Whitfield, I've been reading portions of your grandfather's journal. There are references to additional materials possibly buried somewhere on your property. He mentions insurance against certain outcomes, suggesting he may have hidden backup documentation or equipment. Marcus thought of the 120 acres of orchards, the old growth sections that had been producing fruit since his grandfather's time. How many secrets might be buried beneath trees he had tended his entire life? The financial crisis that had driven him to the auction seemed suddenly insignificant compared to the historical mystery unfolding around him. As the investigation continued into the night, Marcus found himself drawn into conversations with various experts, each revealing new facets of his grandfather's hidden life. A cryptography specialist showed him how Henry had used apple varietals as code names for different Soviet contacts: Golden Delicious for a diplomat in Moscow, Gravenstein for a scientist in Leningrad. The orchard's planting patterns, which Marcus had always assumed were about maximizing sunlight and drainage, apparently also served as a complex cipher system visible only from aerial surveillance. Your grandfather was brilliant, the specialist said with genuine admiration. He created a code system based on agricultural principles that would have been virtually unbreakable to anyone not intimately familiar with both farming and cryptography. It's elegant in its simplicity. The praise felt surreal. The same techniques Marcus had dismissed as old-fashioned during his struggles to modernize the orchard had apparently been sophisticated enough to fool Soviet intelligence services. Every lesson his grandfather had taught him about farming now seemed to carry potential double meanings, agricultural wisdom intertwined with tradecraft. As midnight approached, Agent Mitchell called a temporary halt to the documentation process. "We'll need to continue tomorrow," he announced to his team. "Mr. Whitfield will post security overnight to ensure the site remains secure. I trust you understand the sensitivity of what you've discovered." Marcus nodded, exhausted but unable to imagine sleeping. In the space of a single day, his understanding of his family history had been completely rewritten. The grandfather, who had taught him patience through the seasons of apple cultivation, had been playing a much longer game, one that involved the fate of nations rather than just the success of harvests. Sarah, who had stayed throughout the day offering quiet support, finally prepared to leave. "Call me if you need anything," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "And Marcus, your grandfather would be proud. You've protected his legacy without even knowing what it was." After everyone had gone, leaving security personnel stationed discreetly around the property, Marcus sat alone in his kitchen, the same kitchen where his grandfather had likely planned operations that helped prevent nuclear war. Bailey settled at his feet, the dog's presence a comfort in the strange new reality that had emerged from a desperate bid at a maritime auction. He thought about the financial pressures that had driven him to that auction, the fear of losing, the family orchard that had consumed him for months. Now he understood that he had been protecting something far more significant than agricultural land. The Whitfield legacy wasn't just about growing apples, it was about cultivating peace in the shadows of potential global catastrophe. Opening his grandfather's journal again, Marcus found an entry that seemed particularly relevant. "The work we do in darkness allows others to live in light." Every coded message sent through these channels, every meeting disguised as agricultural consultation, serves a purpose greater than any single harvest. If future generations discover this truth, I hope they understand that ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances can change the course of history. As the night deepened around the farmhouse, Marcus realized his own story was far from over. The discovery in the container was just the beginning. Somewhere in the vast acreage of Whitfield Orchards, more secrets waited to be uncovered, and his grandfather's insurance might hold keys to mysteries that had puzzled intelligence agencies for decades. The financial salvation of the orchard, which had seemed impossible just days before, now appeared likely through the historical significance of what he had found. But more than that, Marcus had discovered a purpose that transcended monetary concerns. He was now the guardian of a legacy that connected his family's agricultural heritage to pivotal moments in world history. Bailey stirred at his feet, then moved to the door, whining softly. Marcus followed the dog outside, where the clear Oregon night revealed a tapestry of stars above the sleeping orchard. The same constellations that had watched over his grandfather's clandestine activities now witnessed the beginning of their revelation. Tomorrow would bring more federal agents, more questions, more pieces of a puzzle that had remained hidden for decades. But tonight, Marcus stood among the apple trees his grandfather had planted, understanding for the first time that they had served as more than sources of fruit. They had been sentinels guarding secrets that helped preserve peace during humanity's most dangerous period. The roots that anchored them to Oregon soil ran deeper than he had ever imagined, connecting past to present in ways that would reshape not just his understanding of his family, but potentially the historical record of the Cold War itself. As He walked back to the house, Bailey padding alongside him. Marcus felt the weight of inheritance in an entirely new way. He had always thought he was struggling to preserve his grandfather's agricultural legacy. They're personnel files, but not American. These are Soviet military records. Bradford leaned in for a closer look, his expression darkening. I recognize some of these names. These were hardliners who disappeared from their posts in 1963, right after the Kennedy assassination. There were rumors they had been planning something, a coup maybe, or worse, if Henry had evidence. The implications hung heavy in the air. Had Henry Whitfield helped prevent more than just nuclear misunderstandings? Had his intelligence network uncovered and stopped a planned catastrophe that history never recorded? The discoveries continued throughout the afternoon. Each excavation site yielded carefully preserved evidence, coded transmissions, photographs, documents in multiple languages. One cache contained what appeared to be scientific equipment modified for intelligence purposes, devices that looked like standard agricultural testing tools, but concealed sophisticated recording technology. Your grandfather was running a full intelligence operation from this orchard, Mitchell marveled. The scope is extraordinary. He wasn't just a courier or a meeting facilitator. He was gathering, analyzing, and preserving intelligence at a level we typically associate with professional agents. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the orchard, the team made their most significant discovery. Beneath the oldest apple tree on the property, a massive wine sap that Henry's father had planted, they found a large metal case containing what Bradford immediately recognized as Soviet military encryption equipment. "This is impossible," Bradford breathed. "This model was never supposed to leave Soviet territory. If Henry managed to acquire this, it means he had contacts at the highest levels. This could have given us access to their most secure communications." The encryption device was in remarkable condition, preserved by the sophisticated environmental controls built into its container. Alongside it were decoded messages that painted a chilling picture of how close the world had come to nuclear war on multiple occasions, thwarted each time by intelligence that had passed through Henry Whitfield's unlikely network. Dr. Novak cross-referenced the messages with known historical events. October 1962, these communications show Soviet submarine commanders receiving orders to arm nuclear torpedoes. But look here, additional messages countermanding those orders sent through back channels. Your grandfather's network may have prevented nuclear exchange during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The weight of the revelation settled over the group. The story emerging from beneath Whitfield Orchards wasn't just about one man's secret service. It was about how a network of ordinary citizens had worked in shadows to prevent global catastrophe, repeatedly pulling the world back from the brink. As darkness fell, portable lights were set up to allow work to continue. Mitchell received a call that caused him to step away from the group, his expression growing increasingly serious as he listened. When he returned, his demeanor had changed noticeably. "We've had inquiries from the Russian Federation," he announced. "Their intelligence services have been monitoring our activity here. They're claiming that some of the materials we're recovering belong to them, that they were stolen state property." Bradford scoffed. "More likely, they're worried about what those materials reveal. There were elements within the KGB who never supported the peace initiatives. If Henry preserved evidence of their activities, the political implications added new complexity to the situation. What had begun as a historical discovery was rapidly becoming a contemporary diplomatic issue. Marcus found himself at the center of competing interests, his grandfather's carefully preserved evidence now subject to international dispute. "There's more," Mitchell continued. We've detected surveillance activity around the perimeter of your property. It appears you're being watched by parties unknown. Given what we're uncovering, this isn't entirely surprising, but it means we need to increase security. The transformation of his quiet orchard into a site of international intrigue felt surreal to Marcus. Yet as he looked at the evidence of his grandfather's service, the sophisticated equipment, the preserved intelligence, the photographic proof of prevented catastrophes, he began to understand the magnitude of the legacy he had inherited. Bailey, who had been unusually alert throughout the day, suddenly began barking toward the eastern boundary of the property. Security personnel responded immediately, their tactical lights sweeping the darkness beyond the fence line. Though they found no immediate threat, the incident underscored the tension that had descended over Whitfield Orchards. Your grandfather knew this day would come, Bradford said quietly, standing beside Marcus as they watched the security sweep. He used to say that truth has its own timing, that secrets preserve themselves until the world is ready to understand them. I think he'd be proud that you're the one bringing his service to light. Doctor, now he understood he had been protecting something far more profound. A testament to how ordinary citizens, working in shadows, had helped prevent extraordinary catastrophe. The morning would bring new challenges, but for now, he found comfort in the knowledge that some secrets, when finally revealed, could illuminate rather than destroy. The next phase of discovery would require him to examine every corner of the property with fresh eyes, to question every family story, every agricultural practice, every seemingly innocent detail of his grandfather's life. But Marcus felt ready for that journey, understanding now that he wasn't just saving an orchard, he was uncovering a chapter of history that deserved to be told, no matter where that truth might lead. Dawn broke over Whitfield Orchards with an unusual bustle of activity. Federal vehicles lined the gravel drive, their occupants already at work cataloging the previous day's discoveries. Marcus watched from his kitchen window as agents moved methodically through his property, some carrying sophisticated scanning equipment toward the older sections of the orchard. The surreal nature of the situation struck him anew. Just days ago, his primary concern had been saving his farm from foreclosure. Now, that same land was the focus of a federal investigation into Cold War espionage. Agent Mitchell arrived at the farmhouse door precisely at 7, accompanied by Dr. Elena Novak and a new figure, a distinguished-looking man in his 70s who carried himself with military bearing despite his civilian clothes. "Mr. Whitfield," Mitchell began, "this is Colonel William Bradford, retired. He worked with your grandfather during the final years of Operation Clearwater." The colonel extended his hand, his grip firm despite his age. "Henry was one of the finest men I ever worked with," he said, his voice carrying the weight of decades-old memories. "When I heard about your discovery, I had to come. There are things about your grandfather's service that have never been documented, stories that deserve to be told." They gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where, according to the journal, Henry Whitfield had hosted clandestine meetings under the guise of agricultural consultations. Colonel Bradford spread out a collection of black and white photographs, some showing younger versions of himself and Henry standing beside what Marcus recognized as the old barn, others depicting men in both American and Soviet military uniforms. "Your grandfather was recruited because of his unique position," Bradford explained. "The Whitfield name carried weight in international agricultural circles. His research on cold-resistant apple varieties had attracted legitimate interest from Soviet agricultural scientists. It provided perfect cover for exchanges of a different nature." Dr. Novak added historical context, explaining how the early 1960s had been a period of extreme tension, with both superpowers developing increasingly destructive weapons while hardliners on both sides pushed for preemptive action. "Moderate," Voices needed accurate intelligence to counter the paranoia and misinformation that could have triggered nuclear war. Your grandfather's network provided that intelligence. Marcus studied the photographs, seeing his grandfather in an entirely new light. The man he remembered, patient, methodical, more comfortable among his trees than in social situations, had apparently possessed the nerve to meet with Soviet intelligence officers to handle classified information that could have cost him his freedom or his life if discovered by the wrong people. The container you found, Bradford continued, was meant to be Henry's insurance policy. He knew that if Operation Clearwater was ever compromised, having physical evidence hidden away could protect him and his family. The fact that he arranged for it to be preserved all these years suggests he believed its contents would someday be important. Bailey, who had been resting near the door, suddenly stood and barked once before trotting toward the window. Outside, more vehicles were arriving, including a specialized truck equipped with ground-penetrating radar. Mitchell excused himself to coordinate with the new arrivals, while Bradford continued sharing memories of Henry Whitfield's covert service. "There's something else," Bradford said, lowering his voice. "Something that wasn't in the official reports. Henry discovered evidence of a mole within our own intelligence community. Someone feeding information to Soviet hardliners who wanted to sabotage the peace efforts. He never trusted that information to regular channels, said he had his own way of preserving it." This revelation added new urgency to the investigation. If Henry had hidden evidence of a traitor within American intelligence, its discovery could have implications far beyond historical interest. Marcus thought of his grandfather's journal entries about insurance and wondered what other secrets might be buried beneath the orderly rows of apple trees. Dr. Novak pulled out a tablet displaying declassified documents from the period. "Your grandfather's agricultural research wasn't just cover, it was integral to the operation. He developed a system of encoding messages within legitimate scientific papers about apple cultivation. Soviet contacts could extract intelligence from what appeared to be routine agricultural correspondence." The sophistication of the system amazed Marcus. His grandfather had turned the very language of farming into a vehicle for international espionage, hiding critical intelligence within discussions of rootstock, grafting techniques, and disease resistance. Every agricultural innovation had potentially served dual purposes. Outside, the ground-penetrating radar team began their systematic sweep of the property. Mitchell returned to report their preliminary findings. "We're detecting several anomalies beneath the older sections of the orchard. Metal objects at depths consistent with deliberate burial rather than natural deposit. With your permission, we'd like to investigate these sites." Marcus nodded, though the thought of excavating his grandfather's carefully maintained orchard felt like disturbing sacred ground. "Whatever's there, it was important enough for him to hide. We need to know what it is." As the day progressed, the first excavation began near a stand of Gravenstein apple trees that Henry had planted in 1962. The careful digging revealed a metal strongbox, smaller than the shipping container, but constructed with similar security features. Inside, wrapped in protective materials, were additional documents and what appeared to be photographic negatives. Dr. Novak handled the materials with reverent care. "These appear to be surveillance photographs," she said, examining the negatives with a specialized viewer. "And these documents." Novak approached with a newly discovered document, her excitement barely contained. "Marcus, look at this. It's a letter from your grandfather to you specifically, sealed with instructions to be opened only if the insurance was ever discovered." With trembling hands, Marcus broke the seal on the envelope, dated 1989, the year before Henry Whitfield's death. The letter inside was written in his grandfather's distinctive hand. "My dear Marcus, if you are reading this, then you have discovered the other harvest I've been tending all these years. I could not tell you while I lived. The oath I took demanded silence, but I always hoped that someday you would understand. The orchard you will inherit is more than trees and soil. It is a testament to the belief that ordinary people can stand against extraordinary evil. The secrets buried here helped prevent a war that would have left no winners, only ashes. Guard them well, but when the time comes, let the truth emerge. The world deserves to know that peace often depends on those willing to work in shadows. Your loving grandfather, Henry." Tears blurred Marcus's vision as he read the words. Grandfather he thought he knew, the patient teacher, the skilled farmer, had been all those things and more. He had been a guardian, standing between civilization and catastrophe, using the cover of apple cultivation to cultivate something far more precious: hope for humanity's survival. The investigation continued through the night, each discovery adding detail to the picture of Henry Whitfield's covert service. Communications equipment yielded recordings of intercepted transmissions. Document caches revealed networks of contacts spanning multiple countries. Photographic evidence showed meetings that officially never happened, agreements that prevented conflicts history barely recorded. By dawn, the scope of Operation Clearwater had expanded far beyond anyone's initial understanding. What had begun as one of many Cold War intelligence operations was revealed to be perhaps the most successful civilian intelligence network of the era, preventing multiple potential flashpoints through carefully managed information exchanges. "Your grandfather's role was unique," Dr. Novak explained as she catalogued another cache of documents. He wasn't just facilitating communication between American and Soviet moderates. He was actively gathering intelligence on extremist elements within both systems, creating a private archive that could expose those pushing for nuclear confrontation. The revelation explained the sophisticated equipment, the multiple burial sites, the elaborate encoding systems. Henry Whitfield hadn't just been supporting official intelligence efforts. He had been running his own parallel operation, creating what amounted to a private intelligence agency dedicated to preserving peace. As the second day of investigation began, international interest intensified. Representatives from various agencies arrived, each claiming jurisdiction over different aspects of the discovery. The State Department sent diplomats to address Russian claims. Military historians came to document the technological aspects. Even former Soviet intelligence officers, now elderly men living in retirement, requested permission to visit, hoping to understand the full scope of the network they had once been part of. Throughout it all, Marcus found himself serving as both witness and guardian. His knowledge of the orchard's layout proved invaluable in locating buried caches. His memories of his grandfather's habits and routines helped investigators understand patterns in the evidence. Most importantly, his presence legitimized the discovery, preventing any single agency from claiming exclusive control over the materials. The financial implications of the discovery hadn't escaped notice either. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save his failing orchard had uncovered historical treasures whose value far exceeded monetary considerations. Museums, universities, and private collectors all expressed interest in the artifacts. Intelligence agencies offered substantial payments for access to the information. The orchard that had teetered on the edge of foreclosure was now potentially worth millions. But for Marcus, the true value lay in understanding his grandfather's courage and dedication. Each piece of evidence revealed new facets of Henry Whitfield's character, his brilliant mind, his steady nerve, his unwavering commitment to preventing nuclear catastrophe. The man who had taught Marcus patience through the seasons of apple growing had been playing a much longer game, nurturing peace through decades of careful, dangerous work. As the investigation entered its third day, a pattern emerged from the accumulated evidence. The materials weren't random collections of intelligence. They told a coherent story of how close the world had come to nuclear war on at least 7 separate occasions, each crisis averted through the intervention of Henry's network. This changes our understanding of Cold War history, one historian declared. We've always known about the public crises, Cuba, Berlin, the Korean conflict. But these documents reveal shadow crises that never made headlines because they were resolved before reaching critical mass. The preservation of this history became the next challenge. How could such sensitive materials be shared with the public while protecting ongoing security interests? How could the story of civilian heroes like Henry Whitfield be told without compromising similar networks that might still exist? These questions occupied the various agencies now invested in the discovery. For Marcus, however, the priority was simpler, honoring his grandfather's legacy while preserving the orchard that had provided cover for world-changing activities. The apple trees that had witnessed secret meetings, that had concealed, buried. Intelligence deserved to continue their dual existence as both agricultural resources and historical monuments. As evening approached on the third day, Bailey led Marcus to one final burial site, a spot near the property line where Henry had maintained a small private garden. There, wrapped in oilcloth and protected by a hand-welded metal box, they found Henry's operational diary, a detailed record of every meeting, every transmission, every crisis averted. The diary's final entry, dated just months before Henry's death, provided a fitting conclusion to the extraordinary story emerging from Whitfield Orchards. The work continues, though my part in it nears its end. I leave behind more than trees and fruit. I leave evidence that ordinary citizens, working together across boundaries of nation and ideology, can prevent the unthinkable. May those who find these records understand that peace is not maintained by governments alone, but by individuals willing to risk everything for the survival of humanity. As Marcus closed the diary, he understood that his discovery at the Portland auction hadn't been chance. Somehow, through channels he might never fully understand, the container had found its way back to the family it belonged to. The secrets Henry Whitfield had preserved were emerging at precisely the moment when the world needed reminders of how individuals could make a difference. The future of Whitfield Orchards was secure now, its financial problems resolved through the historical significance of what lay beneath its soil. But more than that, the orchard had a new mission: to serve as a memorial to the shadow patriots who had worked in secret to preserve peace, and as an inspiration for future generations, facing their own global challenges. As night fell over the excavation sites, Marcus walked among his grandfather's apple trees with new understanding. Each variety told a story, each planting pattern held meaning beyond agriculture. The Gravensteins communicated with contacts in Leningrad. The Winesaps had witnessed meetings with Soviet defectors. The Golden Delicious had provided cover for dead drops and coded transmissions. Tomorrow would bring more discoveries, more revelations about the quiet network that had helped prevent nuclear war. But tonight, Marcus simply appreciated the profound truth his grandfather had understood: that the most important work often happens in shadows, tended by patient hands willing to plant seeds for harvests they might never see. The apple orchard would continue to bear fruit, but its greatest yield had always been the preservation of peace, cultivated by a farmer who understood that some crops were worth any risk to protect. 1 week after the initial discovery, Whitfield Orchards had transformed beyond recognition. The property now resembled a sprawling research facility more than a working farm, with specialized equipment stations positioned throughout the oldest sections of the orchard. White canopy tents protected excavation sites from Oregon's unpredictable spring weather. while portable generators hummed day and night, powering the sophisticated analysis equipment brought in by various government agencies. Security checkpoints had been established at every entrance, with armed personnel maintaining vigilant watch over what had quickly become one of the most significant Cold War intelligence discoveries in decades. Marcus sat in his kitchen, nursing his third cup of coffee while reviewing the preliminary inventory of items recovered from his grandfather's caches. The list ran to dozens of pages, each entry representing another piece of the extraordinary puzzle that had been Henry Whitfield's secret life. Soviet-made recording devices disguised as agricultural testing equipment, microfilm containing classified reports from both American and Soviet sources, custom-built radio transmitters that could be disassembled and hidden within standard farming tools, environmental sensors that had monitored radiation levels during periods of nuclear testing. The artifacts represented technological ingenuity that had transcended Cold War divisions, with innovations from both superpowers adapted and improved by civilian scientists operating in the shadows. Bailey rested his head on Marcus's knee, the dog's calm presence a stark contrast to the controlled chaos that had engulfed their home. Despite the constant activity and unfamiliar people, Bailey had maintained his protective vigilance, seeming to understand instinctively which areas of the property contained materials still waiting to be discovered. Several of the most significant finds had come from following the German Shepherd's unusual interest in specific locations. "I still can't believe the scope of all this," Sarah said, entering the kitchen with another stack of documents from the temporary analysis center established in the barn. As the county's agricultural extension agent, she had been granted special clearance to remain involved in the investigation, her expertise in local farming history providing valuable context for understanding Henry's cover operations. "Your grandfather wasn't just passing messages. According to these reports, he was actively gathering intelligence, analyzing it, and making operational recommendations that shaped policy at the highest levels." Marcus nodded, still struggling to reconcile the grandfather he had known, patient, methodical, seemingly content with his quiet agricultural life, with the covert intelligence operative whose actions had helped prevent nuclear catastrophe on multiple occasions. "I keep wondering how he managed it all, running the orchard, maintaining his cover, coordinating with contacts on both sides, preserving evidence that could have gotten him killed if discovered. Where did he find the strength?" "Perhaps his strength came precisely from understanding what was at stake," suggested Dr. Elena Novak, who had entered the kitchen carrying her tablet loaded with newly digitized material from Henry's journals. Her analysis of the operational diaries had revealed patterns that connected seemingly unrelated events across decades of Cold War tension. "Your grandfather's journals repeatedly reference his fear of what nuclear conflict would mean for future generations. He was fighting for your future, Marcus, for a world where his grandchildren could live without the shadow of atomic annihilation." The profound personal motivation behind Henry's actions had emerged as a consistent theme in the recovered materials. Unlike professional intelligence operatives motivated by ideology or patriotism in the abstract, Henry Whitfield had engaged in his dangerous work with the concrete goal of preserving a livable world for his descendants. The apple trees he had painstakingly developed weren't just agricultural innovations or clever covers for intelligence work. They represented his hope for a future where such trees could continue bearing fruit for generations to come. Agent Mitchell joined them, his expression suggesting new developments. "The Russian delegation has arrived at Portland International. They'll be here within the hour." The news added another layer of tension to the already complex situation, after initial demands for the return of what they claimed was stolen Soviet property. The Russian Federation had shifted to a more collaborative stance, sending a team of historians and intelligence veterans to assess the Whitfield discoveries. "What exactly do they want?" Marcus asked, glancing at the kitchen window where he could see additional security personnel taking positions around the property. "Officially, they're here to authenticate the Soviet origin materials and provide historical context," Mitchell replied. "Unofficially, I suspect they're concerned about what these documents might reveal about certain elements within their intelligence services. Remember, your grandfather's network wasn't just working against American hardliners, pushing for first strikes. They were equally focused on preventing Soviet extremists from triggering nuclear exchanges." The dual-threat nature of Henry's operation had emerged clearly from the recovered documents. While Cold War narratives often portrayed a simple East versus West dichotomy, the Whitfield archives revealed a more nuanced reality. Moderate elements on both sides had secretly cooperated to prevent extremists in their respective governments from pushing the world toward destruction. Henry had served as a crucial node in this shadow network, using his legitimate agricultural contacts to facilitate communications that couldn't happen through official channels. "I've been reviewing the personnel files your grandfather maintained," Dr. Novak said, pulling up encrypted documents on her tablet. "They identify multiple high-ranking Soviet military officers who opposed Khrushchev's more peaceful overtures, including plans for a coup that would have installed leadership committed to preemptive nuclear strikes. Your grandfather's network exposed these plans in 1962, leading to a quiet but extensive purge within Soviet command structures. The Russians will definitely want to know how Henry obtained that information," Mitchell noted. "It represents one of the most successful counterintelligence operations of the entire Cold War, and it happened completely outside official channels. The implications were profound. History books recorded the Cuban Missile Crisis as the closest the world had come to nuclear war, but Henry's archives suggested that an even greater danger had lurked in the shadows, a planned overthrow of Soviet leadership by military hardliners committed to nuclear confrontation. The averted coup had never entered public awareness because both American and Soviet moderates had recognized that exposing it would strengthen extremist positions on both sides." Colonel Bradford entered the kitchen, his military bearing undiminished. By age, the retired intelligence officer who had worked with Henry during Operation Clearwater's final years had become a crucial liaison between the various agencies now involved in analyzing the Whitfield discoveries. "The analysis team just finished decrypting another section of your grandfather's operational logs," he announced. "They cover the period immediately following the Kennedy assassination, when control systems for nuclear launch authorization were in transition." The newly decrypted logs painted a chilling picture of how close the world had come to catastrophe during those chaotic days in November 1963. Henry's network had detected unusual activity at Soviet missile installations, indicating that certain factions were positioning for a potential first strike, while America's leadership was in disarray. Through back channels, facilitated by Operation Clearwater, moderate Soviet officials had received assurance that the U.S. command structure remained intact, preventing what could have become a cascading series of fatal misunderstandings. "Your grandfather never stopped, even after the official operation was shuttered in 1968, Bradford continued. "When government funding was cut, he continued maintaining the network using his own resources. The agricultural patents he developed weren't just cover. They generated the funds that kept Clearwater alive for another decade." This revelation added another dimension to Henry Whitfield's legacy. The innovative farming techniques that had made him respected in agricultural circles, drought-resistant rootstock, cold-hardy apple varieties, integrated pest management systems had not just been scientific achievements or clever cover stories. They had been the financial engine that supported continued intelligence operations when official backing disappeared. The most remarkable aspect, Bradford said, lowering his voice, despite the security measures that protected their conversations, was your grandfather's foresight in preserving evidence of the traitor within our own intelligence community. The individual he identified as Harvest Moon in his encoded communications were still working to determine their actual identity, but the evidence suggests they reached the highest levels of American intelligence before being extracted by the Soviets in 1975. The prospect of exposing a previously unknown high-level mole had electrified the intelligence community, with senior officials from multiple agencies personally reviewing Henry's meticulously preserved evidence. If the Harvest Moon files confirmed the existence and identity of a traitor whose activities had never been detected through official counterintelligence efforts, it would represent both a historical revelation and a vindication of the civilian network Henry had maintained at such personal risk. A security alert from the perimeter interrupted their discussion. The Russian delegation had arrived earlier than expected, their convoy of diplomatic vehicles now approaching the main entrance to Whitfield Orchards. Marcus moved to the window, watching as 4 black sedans with diplomatic plates passed through the security checkpoint and proceeded up the gravel drive toward the farmhouse. "Remember," Mitchell cautioned, "these are primarily historians and intelligence veterans, but they're still representing Russian government interests. Be cordial but careful about what information you share beyond what's already been cleared for discussion." The delegation that emerged from the vehicles presented a striking contrast. Elderly men, whose bearings suggested military or intelligence backgrounds, were accompanied by younger analysts carrying digital equipment. Leading them was a distinguished woman in her 60s, her silver hair cut in a practical bob, her expression suggesting both scholarly interest and professional assessment. "Professor Yelena Baranova," Dr. Novak whispered to Marcus. "Former KGB analyst, now Russia's leading historian on Cold War intelligence operations. If they're sending her, they're taking this very seriously." Mitchell met the delegation at the door, performing introductions with diplomatic precision. Professor Baranova stepped forward, extending her hand first to Marcus. "Mr. Whitfield," she said in lightly accented English, "thank you for allowing this visit. What your grandfather preserved may help both our nations understand a crucial period in our shared history." The formal cordiality of the interaction belied the complicated emotions beneath the surface. These visitors represented the government Henry Whitfield had worked against in some respects, yet collaborated with in others. The dual nature of Operation Clearwater, opposing extremists on both sides while facilitating communication between moderates, created an ambiguous legacy that defied simple Cold War narratives. My grandfather's journals mention Soviet colleagues who shared his commitment to preventing nuclear confrontation, Marcus said carefully. "I believe he would approve of this collaboration to understand the full scope of their efforts." Baranova nodded, a hint of appreciation in her eyes. "Your grandfather understood what many politicians on both sides failed to grasp, that mutual destruction would recognize no ideology. The materials he preserved may help us document how rational actors within opposed systems found ways to cooperate despite the madness surrounding them." The delegation was led to the main exhibition area where the most significant discoveries had been arranged for secure viewing. Under the watchful eyes of security personnel from both nations, Russian experts began examining the Soviet origin equipment, their occasional murmurs of surprise suggesting that some items represented technological variants previously unknown to them. This encryption device, one elderly Russian analyst noted, pointing to the sophisticated machine found beneath the oldest apple tree, was prototype technology. Only 12 units were manufactured before the project was abruptly terminated in 1964. According to our records, all were destroyed when the leading designer defected. He looked up, his expression a mix of professional admiration and personal wonder, yet here is number 7, perfectly preserved and apparently operational. Professor Baranova was examining the personnel files related to the averted Soviet coup of 1962. "These names," she murmured, "match our historical records of a reliability review within military command. But our archives never indicated the actual conspiracy these officers were involved in." She turned to Colonel Bradford. "Your government has always claimed this intelligence came from a high-level mole within Soviet military circles." Bradford maintained a neutral expression. That was the official explanation, provided to those with need-to-know clearance. "Yet these files suggest the information came through Whitfield's civilian network," Baranova continued, "specifically from moderate elements within Soviet intelligence who opposed the planned coup." She shook her head slightly. "History is rarely as simple as our official narratives suggest. The Russians' recognition of the material's authenticity added legitimacy to the Whitfield discoveries, transforming what might have been dismissed as an elaborate American intelligence operation into an acknowledged historical record. Their expertise helped identify equipment whose purpose had puzzled American analysts, while their knowledge of Soviet intelligence structures provided context. Henry's encoded references to contacts and operations. As the day progressed, the formality between the American and Russian contingents gradually relaxed, replaced by professional collaboration between historians and intelligence veterans, united by shared fascination with the Whitfield archives. Academic interests transcended national boundaries as experts from former enemy nations worked together to reconstruct a hidden history that belonged to both their countries. Bailey, who had been observing the proceedings with characteristic attention, suddenly stood and moved toward one of the Russian intelligence veterans, an elderly man who had been quietly examining Henry's custom-built radio equipment. The dog's behavior wasn't aggressive, but displayed an unusual intensity that caught Marcus's attention. The Russian noticed as well, meeting the German shepherd's gaze with a thoughtful expression. "Remarkable animal," the man said, extending a hand for Bailey to sniff. "You know, we had a saying in my former profession, trust the dog's instincts when human perception fails. They sense things we cannot." Marcus watched as Bailey allowed the elderly Russian to pat his head, a level of acceptance the protective dog rarely granted to strangers. "He's been instrumental in locating several of the buried caches. Sometimes, I think he knows exactly what we're looking for, even when we don't." The Russian nodded. "Perhaps he does in his way." He hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "Mr. Whitfield, my name is Viktor Petrov. I was not properly introduced earlier because my role in these events remains sensitive, even after all these years. But I believe I should tell you, I met your grandfather 3 times during the operational period of Clearwater. He impressed me as a man of extraordinary courage and uncommon wisdom." The revelation stunned Marcus. Here, standing in his family's barn, was someone who had actually known Henry during his covert activities. A living connection to the grandfather whose secret life he was still struggling to comprehend. "You were one of his Soviet contacts?" Petrov glanced around, ensuring they weren't overheard. "I was part of a group within Soviet intelligence committed to preventing nuclear war. We used your grandfather's agricultural connections to pass information that couldn't move through official channels." He smiled slightly. "I still remember the apple brandy he offered during our 3rd meeting. He said it was made from a variety he had named peaceful coexistence, a small joke between us that could have cost both our lives if the wrong people had understood it. This human detail, his grandfather's quiet humor even in the midst of dangerous espionage, touched Marcus deeply. It connected the covert operative documented in classified files to the man he had known, who had taught him about apple cultivation with patient good humor and an appreciation for life's small ironies. "There is something else you should know," Petrov continued. "The container you discovered, it was not supposed to remain buried indefinitely. According to our contingency protocols, it should have been retrieved during the transition period of 1989-1991, when the Soviet system was collapsing. Someone made a decision to leave it in place, perhaps understanding that the time wasn't right for these truths to emerge." The timing aligned with Henry's final illness. He had died in early 1990, perhaps before he could implement whatever retrieval plan had been established. Or perhaps, as Petrov suggested, he had made a conscious choice to leave the container buried, trusting that it would emerge when the world was ready to understand its contents. "Do you know what my grandfather meant by his insurance policy?" Marcus asked. He mentioned it repeatedly in his journals, suggesting there was evidence he had preserved in case Operation Clearwater was compromised. Petrov's expression grew more solemn. The insurance was documentation of extremist factions on both sides, American and Soviet, who actively worked to increase tensions and push for nuclear first strikes. Your grandfather collected evidence of their activities, creating a record that could expose them if they ever succeeded in undermining the back channel communications Clearwater had established. The revelation explained the comprehensive nature of Henry's archives, which documented not just the network's successes, but the specific threats they had worked against. The insurance wasn't just about protecting himself or his family, it was about having evidence that could stop extremists if they ever gained the upper hand in either government. "Mr. Whitfield," Petrov said, his voice dropping further, "there are still people in positions of power in my country and in yours who would prefer certain aspects of this history remain buried. Your grandfather understood this, which is why he created redundancies in his preservation system. I suspect you have not yet found all that he left behind." The warning sent a chill through Marcus. The historical significance of the discoveries had overshadowed potential contemporary implications, but Petrov's words suggested that some of the power structures Henry had documented might still exist in modern form, their descendants continuing to occupy influential positions within both Russian and American systems. As if sensing the serious turn in their conversation, Bailey nudged Marcus's hand with his nose, drawing his attention back to the present moment. The gesture reminded him that whatever revelations and complications lay ahead, he wasn't facing them alone. He had allies, both human and canine, and the strength of his grandfather's example to guide him. The formal examination of materials continued throughout the afternoon, with experts from both delegations sharing insights and gradually constructing a more complete picture of Operation Clearwater's scope and significance. The collaboration itself represented a kind of victory for Henry's vision. Former adversaries working together to understand a shared history, prioritizing truth over nationalist narratives. As evening approached, Professor Baranova requested a private conversation with Marcus, Colonel Bradford, and Agent Mitchell. They gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, the same space where, according to Henry's journals, crucial meetings with Soviet contacts had taken place decades earlier. "There is something I must share with you," Baranova began, her manner suggesting the seriousness of what she was about to reveal. "Based on the materials we have examined today, it appears that Operation Clearwater prevented not just one or two potential nuclear exchanges, but at least 7 distinct crisis points where launch protocols were in preliminary stages on one or both sides. The number exceeded even the most dramatic estimates made by American analysts reviewing Henry's archives. 7 moments when the world had approached the precipice of nuclear war, each averted through the information exchanged via civilian channels like the network Henry had helped maintain. Furthermore, Baranova continued, the evidence suggests that the most serious of these crisis points never entered official historical records because acknowledging how close we came to annihilation would have been politically untenable for both governments. The November 1983 incident, for example, your historical accounts mention tensions during the Able Archer exercises, but Henry's records indicate actual preliminary launch protocols were initiated by nervous Soviet officers convinced a first strike was imminent. Colonel Bradford nodded grimly. The full severity was downplayed in our official records as well. Few people know how close we came during those weeks. Reagan was shaken when he finally learned the details. This pattern appears consistently, Baranova observed. The public historical record acknowledges recognized crises like Cuba and Berlin, but what your grandfather documented were the shadow crises, moments when miscalculation nearly led to disaster without ever becoming public knowledge. The implications were profound. The history taught in schools and universities captured only the visible peaks of Cold War tension, missing the hidden moments when civilization had truly teetered on the edge of destruction. Henry Whitfield and others like him had preserved not just lives but the very possibility of human continuity, all while remaining anonymous in historical accounts. There is another matter, Baranova said, her voice growing even more serious. The individual identified in your grandfather's files as Harvest Moon. We have reason to believe this person may have connections to power structures that still exist. Their identity would be extremely sensitive even today. Mitchell leaned forward. Are you suggesting the Russian government has knowledge of who this American traitor was? Baranova chose her words with obvious care. I am suggesting that certain factions within both our governments might prefer this particular aspect of history remain unexplored. The networks that Harvest Moon was part of, they didn't simply disappear when the Cold War ended. Some transformed themselves, adapted to new geopolitical realities. The warning echoed what Petrov had told Marcus earlier, reinforcing the sense that Henry's insurance policy might have contemporary relevance beyond its historical significance. The extremist elements his grandfather had documented hadn't been defeated. They had evolved, perhaps continuing to operate within the power structures of both former superpowers. My official instructions are to request copies of all materials related to Soviet operations and equipment, Baranova said, returning to her formal diplomatic role. However, I would like to propose a joint historical commission instead, Russian and American scholars working together to document this shared history properly, without nationalist filters or redactions. The proposal represented an unprecedented level of cooperation in Cold War historical research. Rather than each nation claiming pieces of the Whitfield discoveries for their separate archives, Baranova was suggesting a collaborative approach that would preserve the integrity of Henry's materials while allowing scholars from both countries equal access. I believe my superiors will accept this arrangement, she continued, particularly when they understand that certain files might be most safely maintained through shared stewardship rather than exclusive control by either government. Her careful phrasing suggested another layer of meaning. The joint custody of the most sensitive materials would ensure that neither country could bury uncomfortable truths about their own extremist factions. The shared access would function as a kind of mutual insurance policy, much as Henry's original preserved evidence had been designed to do. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. I'll need to consult with Washington. But speaking personally, I believe this approach honors the spirit of what Henry Whitfield was trying to accomplish. His network transcended national boundaries to preserve something more important than ideological victory. As discussions of the practical details continued, Marcus found himself drawn to the window overlooking the orchard his grandfather had tended for decades. The apple trees stood in their orderly rows, many of them planted. During the height of Henry's covert activities, they had served as both literal cover for his intelligence work and metaphorical reminders of what he was fighting to preserve: the possibility of future harvests in a world not devastated by nuclear fire. Bailey joined him at the window, the dog's steady presence a counterpoint to the historical complexities being discussed behind them. Marcus absently scratched behind the shepherd's ears, thinking about the strange path that had led from a desperate bid at a maritime auction to this extraordinary moment of international historical cooperation. He would have appreciated this, Marcus said softly to the dog, seeing former adversaries working together to understand the truth. That was always his goal. Getting past ideological divisions to recognize our shared humanity. The next morning brought new visitors to Whitfield Orchards. Representatives from major museums and academic institutions arrived, seeking to understand how the discoveries might be preserved and presented to the public. Their presence represented yet another dimension of Henry's legacy, the educational impact his preserved materials might have on future generations' understanding of the Cold War. Marcus met with them in the visitor space that had been hastily established in one of the equipment barns, where selected items from Henry's archives were displayed with appropriate security measures. Dr. Novak had taken the lead in explaining the historical significance of the discoveries, her scholarly expertise helping translate the complex intelligence materials into narratives accessible to non-specialists. What we're seeing here, she explained to the assembled museum curators and historians, is evidence of what we might call shadow diplomacy, communications and negotiations that occurred outside official channels, operated by civilians with the tacit approval but official deniability of their governments. Henry Whitfield's network represents perhaps the most successful example of this phenomenon during the Cold War era. A representative from the Smithsonian raised the question of public exhibition. These materials are clearly of enormous historical significance, but how do we balance public education with ongoing security concerns? Some of this technology, even decades old, could still have sensitive applications. The question highlighted the complexity of Henry's legacy. His preserved evidence was simultaneously historical artifact, potential intelligence asset, and political liability for power structures that preferred certain truths remain hidden. Any public presentation would require careful curation to serve educational purposes without compromising still relevant security interests. We envision a graduated approach, Mitchell responded. Certain materials can be made immediately available for public exhibition. Others will require longer declassification processes. The most sensitive documents may remain accessible only to cleared researchers for some time. The compromise seemed reasonable, though Marcus noted the inherent tension between historical transparency and security considerations. His grandfather had preserved these materials specifically to ensure certain truths couldn't be buried, yet institutional forces still worked to control their release, a dynamic Henry himself might have recognized all too well. As the museum representatives toured the exhibition area, Sarah approached Marcus with news from the agricultural side of operations. The State Historical Preservation Office called. They're fast-tracking the designation of Whitfield Orchards as a site of Historical significance. It will come with grants for both preservation and ongoing agricultural operations. The development represented a concrete solution to the financial crisis that had driven Marcus to the Portland auction in the first place. The historical designation would bring resources that could save the struggling orchard, ensuring it continued not just as a working farm, but as a living monument to Henry Whitfield's dual legacy in agriculture and international security. They're particularly interested in preserving the apple varieties your grandfather developed, Sarah continued. It turns out several of his cold, hardy strains are now considered important genetic resources for climate adaptation research. His agricultural innovations may prove as significant for food security as his intelligence work was for international security. The connection between Henry's two fields of expertise seemed fitting. In both domains, he had worked to ensure future generations would inherit a world capable of sustaining life, whether through apple trees, adapted to changing climate conditions, or through diplomatic backchannels that prevented nuclear catastrophe. Colonel Bradford joined them, his expressions suggesting new developments. The analysis team just decoded another section of your grandfather's operational diary. It appears he maintained contact with certain Soviet intelligence officers well into the 1980s, long after official relations between our agencies had deteriorated. The continued operation of Henry's network during the renewed Cold War tensions of the Reagan era represented another remarkable chapter in his covert activities. While official communication channels had narrowed during that period of heightened rhetoric and military buildup, Henry had apparently maintained the human connections established during earlier cooperation. According to these entries, Bradford continued, "Your grandfather's network played a crucial role during the 1983 Able Archer crisis. When Soviet leadership became convinced that NATO exercises were cover for an actual nuclear first strike, information passed through Clearwater's back channels helped prevent a preemptive Soviet launch." This revelation aligned with Professor Baranova's comments about shadow crises that had never entered public historical accounts. The world had come far closer to nuclear war in November 1983 than most people realized, with Soviet forces placed on unprecedented alert levels based on misinterpretation of NATO exercises. Henry's network had apparently provided crucial context that helped Soviet moderates argue successfully against launch authorization. He never stopped, Marcus mused, thinking of the grandfather he had known during those years, a man approaching 70, supposedly focused on developing new apple varieties while quietly continuing the most important work of his life. Even when official cooperation between our countries was at its lowest point, he maintained the human connections that could prevent catastrophe. As the day progressed, additional excavations revealed more of Henry's carefully preserved evidence. A cache discovered beneath the equipment shed contained recording devices and photographs, documenting meetings between American and Soviet intelligence officials that officially never occurred. The materials confirmed that at the height of public Cold War rhetoric, behind-the-scenes cooperation had continued through networks like Operation Clearwater. The most significant discovery came late in the afternoon, when Bailey's persistent interest in the farmhouse cellar led investigators to a hidden compartment beneath the concrete floor. Inside, protected by sophisticated environmental controls, powered by a system that had remained operational for decades, they found what appeared to be Henry Whitfield's master files, the complete operational history of his network, including the full dossier on the individual code-named Harvest Moon. The security around this discovery exceeded all previous measures. Access to the cellar was immediately restricted to the highest clearance levels, with armed guards positioned at all approaches to the farmhouse. Marcus himself was asked to remain outside while initial analysis of the materials took place, a request that highlighted the extraordinary sensitivity of what his grandfather had preserved. Hours later, Mitchell emerged from the cellar, accompanied by senior officials who had arrived via helicopter specifically to assess this latest discovery. Their expressions suggested the gravity of what they had found. "Mr. Whitfield," Mitchell said, "what your grandfather preserved here goes beyond historical significance. These files document a penetration of American intelligence at the highest levels, with implications that extend into the present day. Indeed, the files apparently revealed that Harvest Moon had not been a single traitor but the code name for a network of ideologically motivated officials who had occupied positions of influence within American intelligence and diplomatic services. From the 1950s through at least the 1980s, some had been Soviet assets, others simply extremists whose apocalyptic worldview led them to actively work for nuclear confrontation, believing their side would emerge victorious from the ashes. Most disturbing was evidence suggesting that elements of this network had survived the Cold War's end, transforming their methods and objectives while maintaining their fundamental opposition to international cooperation. Names in Henry's files, connected to current political and corporate figures whose hardline positions on nuclear policies and international relations suddenly appeared in a more sinister light. "These materials will require the most careful handling," Mitchell said. "Your grandfather preserved evidence that could potentially identify individuals still active in positions of influence. There will be enormous institutional pressure to bury or discredit these findings." The warning echoed what both Petrov and Baranova had suggested, that Henry's insurance policy represented a threat not just to historical narratives but to contemporary power structures derived from the extremist factions he had documented. The truth he had preserved remained dangerous even decades later. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, aware that the discoveries had moved beyond historical research into active counterintelligence territory. "In the short term, these materials will be moved to secure facilities for comprehensive analysis," Mitchell replied. "Longer term, decisions about declassification and public disclosure will involve the highest levels of government. Your grandfather created quite a dilemma for us. Evidence too comprehensive to dismiss, but too explosive to fully acknowledge." The situation presented Marcus with his own dilemma. As Henry Whitfield's grandson and the legal owner of the property where the evidence had been discovered, he had certain rights regarding the materials. Yet, the national security implications clearly transcended private ownership considerations. His grandfather had preserved this evidence to ensure certain truths couldn't be buried, but institutional forces were already moving to control access to those truths. "I want to respect both national security concerns and my grandfather's intentions," Marcus said carefully. He didn't preserve this evidence just to have it disappear into classified archives. He wanted accountability for those who pushed the world toward nuclear war. Mitchell nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your position. Perhaps we can find a balanced approach, securing the most sensitive materials while ensuring their contents inform appropriate investigations and eventually enter the historical record when security concerns permit." The compromise seemed reasonable, though Marcus remained concerned about institutional tendencies to protect powerful interests through excessive classification. His grandfather had operated outside official channels precisely because he understood how systems could be manipulated to bury uncomfortable truths. That evening, after the day's official activities had concluded, Marcus found himself sitting alone in Henry's study, a room that had remained largely unchanged since his grandfather's death. The bookshelves still held agricultural reference, volumes interspersed with works on international relations and military history that, in retrospect, reflected Henry's dual interests. The desk where he had presumably written his encoded communications stood by the window overlooking the orchard, its surface now cleared of operational materials, but still bearing the worn impression of decades of use. Bailey lay at Marcus's feet, the dog's steady presence a comfort amid the emotional and intellectual turbulence of the past week. Outside, security personnel maintained their vigilant watch over the property, their movements visible as occasional shadows passing through the pools of light from security lamps. Marcus opened the bottom drawer of Henry's desk, retrieving a leather-bound volume he had discovered years earlier but never fully appreciated. His grandfather's personal journal, distinct from the operational diaries now held in secure storage, where the operational records documented activities and intelligence in coded language. This journal captured Henry Whitfield's private thoughts, his fears and hopes, as he balanced his dangerous covert life with his public identity as a simple farmer. The entry, dated October 28, 1962, the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, seemed particularly relevant to Marcus's current situation. The world stands closer to annihilation than at any point in human history, yet most people continue their daily routines unaware of how tenuous our existence has become. Communications passed through our network yesterday may have prevented a launch order that would have triggered automatic response protocols. If we succeed, history books will record this crisis as a diplomatic standoff resolved through official channels. No one will know how close we truly came, or how ordinary citizens working in shadows helped pull us back from the edge. Perhaps that anonymity is the greatest gift we can offer, allowing people to live without the burden of knowing how near we came to ending everything. The profound humility of his grandfather's reflection moved Marcus deeply. Henry had understood that his greatest success would be measured by absence, the apocalypse that didn't happen, the millions who lived without ever knowing they had been saved. He had worked without expectation of recognition or reward, motivated by the simple, profound desire to ensure life could continue. Another entry, written during the renewed tensions of the early 1980s, revealed the personal toll of Henry's long service. Attended the agricultural conference in Berlin last week, met with our old contacts from the other side. Their faces have aged as mine has, all of us growing old in this strange shadow war that never ends. We spoke of grandchildren. They showed pictures of theirs. I shared stories of young Marcus, who shows such promise with the apple trees. Neither side mentioned directly what remains unspoken between us, that everything we have done, all the risks taken over these many years, has been for those children, so they might inherit something other than ashes and radiation. One old friend, I cannot name him even here, embraced me at parting and whispered, "We have given them time." Perhaps that is all we can hope for. Time for wiser generations to find better solutions than mutual annihilation. The personal connection across ideological lines had sustained Henry's network through decades of official hostility between their governments. While politicians and military leaders had postured and threatened, these aging men had continued their quiet work of preventing the unthinkable, united by the shared desire to preserve a future for their grandchildren. A final entry, dated just months before Henry's death in 1990, seemed to anticipate the discoveries now unfolding. The Cold War appears to be ending, though perhaps not as conclusively as the politicians claim. I have ensured the evidence remains preserved, protected against both physical degradation and deliberate suppression. Someday, when the world is ready to understand what truly happened during these decades, the insurance will serve its purpose, Not for my vindication, I expect and desire no recognition, but because the patterns I have documented may emerge again in new forms. The impulse toward destruction, the ideological blindness that values victory over survival, these human tendencies don't disappear with changing political systems. Future generations may need these warnings, these examples of how close we came and how ordinary people helped prevent disaster. If you are reading this, Marcus, know that everything I did for you and those who will come after. The orchards I planted and the secrets I preserved were always about the same essential purpose, ensuring there would be harvests in years I would never live to see. His grandfather's uncanny foresight, understanding that the evidence he preserved would remain relevant beyond the Cold War's official end, reinforced Marcus's determination to honor both the letter and spirit of Henry's intentions. 2. Years after the discovery of the shipping container, Whitfield Orchards had transformed into something Henry could never have imagined, yet would have deeply approved. The property now hosted a unique blend of working apple farm and living historical museum, where visitors could walk among the same trees that had witnessed clandestine Cold War meetings while learning about both agricultural innovation and shadow diplomacy. Marcus stood on the newly constructed observation deck overlooking the northwestern section of the orchard, where Bailey had first discovered the container. The morning sun filtered through apple blossoms, creating dappled patterns on the memorial plaque that acknowledged Henry Whitfield's dual contributions to agricultural science and international security. The German Shepherd lay nearby, now showing grey around his muzzle, but still maintaining his alert watchfulness over the property he had helped transform. "The Korean delegation arrives in an hour," Sarah reminded him, consulting her tablet as she joined him at the railing. Her role had evolved from county agricultural agent to director of international programs at the Whitfield Center for Citizen Diplomacy, the non-profit organization established to continue Henry's legacy of cross-border cooperation in times of heightened tension. The request from South Korean officials to study the Whitfield model had come amid escalating nuclear rhetoric on the Korean peninsula. They sought to understand how civilian networks might establish back-channel communications when official. Diplomatic relations deteriorated, exactly the kind of practical application of historical lessons that Henry's preserved materials had made possible. Professor Baranova confirmed she'll join us by video conference for the afternoon session, Sarah continued. She thinks the Whitfield protocols could be adapted for the current situation in Eastern Europe as well. The Russian historian had become an unexpected ally in the effort to apply Henry's methods to contemporary crises. After helping authenticate the Soviet materials found at Whitfield Orchards, she had returned to Moscow to establish a parallel research center focused on civilian peace initiatives during periods of international tension. Their ongoing collaboration had produced training programs for non-governmental organizations operating in conflict zones around the world. "Any word from Washington about the declassification review?" Marcus asked, thinking of the ongoing bureaucratic battle to release additional materials from his grandfather's archives. While much of Henry's evidence had entered the public domain through museum exhibitions and academic publications, certain files remained classified, their content still deemed sensitive decades after they were created. Colonel Bradford says, "The committee is close to approval on the 1983 files," Sarah replied. "The 40-year rule works in our favor, but there's still resistance from certain quarters." The resistance came primarily from those with connections to the network Henry had codenamed Harvest Moon, hardliners whose descendants still occupied positions within security establishments on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. Though most of the original conspirators had died, Their institutional legacies remained, manifest in policies and protégés that continued advocating confrontational approaches to international relations. Yet that resistance faced increasing challenges from a new generation, inspired by what Henry Whitfield's archives had revealed. Young diplomats, military officers, and intelligence analysts now studied the Clearwater Protocols as examples of how independent networks could maintain reason and humanity when official systems faltered. The declassified portions of Henry's operational diaries had become required reading at diplomatic academies and intelligence training facilities around the world. The financial crisis that had driven Marcus to that fateful maritime auction now seemed like a distant memory. The orchard's historical designation had brought preservation grants and educational funding that ensured its continued operation for generations to come. More importantly, it had transformed a struggling family farm into a living laboratory where agricultural scientists and international relations experts worked side by side, continuing Henry's dual legacy in ways he could never have anticipated. Bailey suddenly stood, ears forward, detecting approaching vehicles before the sound became audible to human ears. Minutes later, a small convoy of diplomatic cars appeared on the access road, bearing the South Korean delegation, eager to learn how one ordinary farmer had helped prevent nuclear catastrophe through agricultural cover and personal courage. As Marcus moved to greet the visitors, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a desperate bid at a Portland auction. The container he had purchased, hoping to find salvageable equipment, had instead revealed a historical legacy that continued influencing international relations decades after his grandfather's death. The story of Henry Whitfield, farmer, patriot, and shadow diplomat, now served as inspiration for those seeking humanitarian solutions to geopolitical challenges around the world. The Korean delegation emerged from their vehicles, led by a serious-looking diplomat whose expression softened as Bailey approached with cautious curiosity. The universal language of human-animal connection provided a moment of warmth before the serious business of discussing nuclear tensions and back-channel communications. "Welcome to Whitfield Orchards," Marcus said, extending his hand. "We have much to discuss about how ordinary citizens can contribute to peace when official channels prove insufficient." As he led them toward the visitor center, housed in the renovated barn, Marcus felt a profound sense of continuity with his grandfather's work. Henry had planted both apple trees and seeds of peace, tending each with equal care and dedication. Now, his grandson continued that dual cultivation, ensuring both would continue bearing fruit for generations to come. The Whitfield legacy had evolved from a family secret to an international resource, proving that the most significant contributions to history often come from unexpected sources. Ordinary individuals who recognize their capacity to influence. Extraordinary events through quiet courage and unwavering commitment to humanity's shared future. Bailey followed the group at a respectful distance, the faithful companion whose mysterious sensitivity had uncovered secrets buried for decades. Like his master, the dog seemed to understand that some treasures are meant to be discovered only when the world is ready to receive them, when their truths can serve not just as historical documentation, but as practical guidance for navigating contemporary challenges. As apple blossoms drifted on the spring breeze, the trees Henry had planted decades earlier stood as living witnesses to both past achievements and future possibilities, proving that some legacies, properly tended, continue growing long after. Their planters have returned to the soil from which all life emerges and to which all eventually returns. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.